I've got about 2 or 3 hours worth of stuff I'd like to tell you in the next 15 minutes. Okay. All right. Sensitive. I could talk about lots of things, but the thing I think is most important for this meeting is to try to put the kind of work that we do at DOPS into a bigger perspective. I mean, clearly the question, what happens when we die, is a rather big one. Most of us would like to know the answer to that. And a lot of our work has been focused on that subject. But our work is really part of a much bigger thing that is gathering momentum as we sit here and talk. And it has to do with a kind of worldview that has emerged over the last several centuries, particularly in the past century or so, and really kind of taken over, and in particular taken over central parts of the scientific establishment, in particular the kind of folks I work. I'm a psychologist by training, experimental psychologist, also have done a lot of neuroscience. Psychologists and neuroscience are totally committed, with few exceptions, to this kind of picture that I'm about to describe to you. And we think that picture is basically false, and we're trying to overturn it. So what is that picture? Physicalism is the word that's used to describe it in its sort of philosophical form. And it's a kind of modern descendant of what used to be called materialism over the past several centuries. The basic idea is that, I mean, it comes in several different flavors, but they share in common some really crucial ideas. Basically, all facts are determined by physical facts alone. Reality consists at bottom of little bits of self-existent stuff flying around in fields of force according to mathematical laws. Everything in consciousness, mind and consciousness, consciousness and its contents, are generated by physiological events and processes in your brain. Your sense of yourself as an effective conscious agent having impacts on the world, it's all kind of an illusion, byproducts of the grinding of your neural machinery. And since everything in mind and consciousness is generated by the brain, when you die and your brain stops working, that's it, end of the game. It's all over. On a more cosmic sort of scale, we see no signs of any final causes in nature, no sign of anything transcendent. In the grand scheme, it looks as though everything is devoid of meaning or purpose. That's pretty grim, don't you think? And yet that's what the great majority of working scientists, particularly non-physicists, believe today, and in particular psychologists and neuroscientists, and most philosophers of mind. Well, I have to say also, this is pretty much what I believed when I started in graduate school, up the river there. It wasn't that we, graduate students were sitting around talking about these things and coming to some rational decision that really is how things are. Don't like it, but that's just how it is, so get used to it. Instead, it was just, it was kind of part of the furniture of the place, almost the atmosphere. You just kind of absorbed it passively. It was just kind of in the background of everything we did. The everyday sort of experimental stuff all kind of relied upon that as background, but nobody really talked about it very much. Anyway, so I swallowed the whole thing, hook, line, and sinker pretty much. Lapsed Catholic, gave up my Catholicism about the first week in college and all that, and never thought about any of that stuff since then. But then sort of late in my graduate school career, I had two sort of shocks. The first one was that a project that I was working on had to do with computer recognition of the most important senses of high-frequency words in context. And I worked on that diligently for a number of years, and it turned out to be a whole lot harder than anybody had led me to believe it would be. In fact, it's led me to be very skeptical in general about the computational theory of the mind. This was the big new thing at that time, taking over from behaviorism. I mean, you have to appreciate that back in the 1960s, this was a big step forward, because starting in 1913, shortly after William James's death, it had become unfashionable even to use the word consciousness in polite company, scientifically speaking. So this was kind of a step forward. We were at least willing to talk about mind and things going on inside. Anyway, so that was a kind of a shock to me and a disappointment. And right about the same time, for personal reasons I won't go into, I started getting interested in experimental parapsychology. And the reason was, basically, as Kim just indicated, that the property that really defines all of these phenomena is that if the physical story were true, they couldn't happen. So if you get information about some physically remote state of affairs or something that's going to happen tomorrow, or something that happened yesterday without reading a newspaper or something like that, or if you can have an effect on your environment without using your muscles, then those things just should not happen. And that's theoretically interesting, right? I mean, there are two ways to react to this. You say, oh, that's horrible, let's put it aside, and that's the most common reaction in the scientific world. But for people who have their sort of antennae up for important developments, wow, that makes the stuff really interesting. That's why we should study it. That's why William James was interested in. I mean, I learned that early on in my exploration of these things, and I hadn't learned it from any of my colleagues in William James Hall. In fact, I don't think half a dozen of them knew about it. He spent half his adult life studying these things. Amazing. Okay, so I decided, throw caution to the winds. I went to work for J.B. Ryan, pretty much right out of graduate school after a postdoc. And I had been at his place for about a month when a guy came in who's undoubtedly one of the best subjects ever to come into a parapsychology laboratory. And I won't bore you with the details of what happened, but basically any doubts that I had about the reality of psi phenomena were blown away by this guy in the first day that he was there. And it kind of went on and on from there. We can say that, I think, without a moment's hesitation. Take it to the bank. Psi phenomena are real. They happen, and we're going to have to come to grips with that fact in our scientific thinking, period. Now, survival is a more complicated subject because, let's say, in the case, well, I'll mention a couple of other kinds of research that we have been involved in at DOPS related to survival. One involves what are called crisis apparitions, and they go way back to the beginnings of the Society for Psychical Research. A typical kind of situation is where, in the old days, a woman in her kitchen in London suddenly sees her brother come in, you know, sort of out of the corner of her eye, which surprises her because, as far as she knows, he's over in India with some British regiment or something. Well, then it turns out he appears, he looks like hell, he disappears, and a week later they get the news that he was just killed in a battle over there. And there are hundreds, well, there are really thousands of these cases. Many of them are very well documented as to what the experience was. Often the person would tell somebody else who wrote it down. You know, dates of events could be documented with affidavits and things of that sort. So there's a lot of those. And another big area, which William James, again, was involved in, is mediumship. James discovered one of the great trance mediums of all time, Mrs. Piper. Everybody know about Mrs. Piper? Well, I mean, she's typical of good mediums who can appear to deliver information from persons who are deceased. In her case, it got to really quite extraordinary heights of development. There was one personality, for example, GP, who was a communicator through Mrs. Piper to sitters who represented himself as being the deceased George Pellew, as he was known. During the time that he was studied by James and Richard Hodgson, an Australian lawyer who was hired really for this purpose, 150 different sitters were introduced anonymously to her during her trances, of whom 30 had been acquaintances of the real GP in his lifetime. And the GP persona, speaking through Mrs. Piper or writing, sometimes automatic writing, identified all and only those 30, and for many of them gave so much personal information in such a characteristically GP way that they were convinced that they were really interacting directly with a deceased person. Now, turns out to be not so simple to decide whether that does or doesn't establish survival, because how do you check whether the information delivered is true? Well, either someone tells you, yeah, that was true, or you find some record, and hence, in principle, it's open to the possibility of some sort of a psi process involving only living persons. And that debate goes on and on still. There are people equally knowledgeable about the evidence who take one side or the other. So it's a tough problem. But I'd like to point out that either horn of this dilemma is really fatal to the prevailing physicalism, because both psi and survival shouldn't happen according to the prevailing view. Now, this became an important part of a project that I got involved in. Well, let me just say very briefly, because I don't have enough time, that I continue my own work, experimental work, first at Rhines Place, then moved over to the School of Engineering at Duke, because we wanted to develop a psychophysiological approach to the study of psi, measure brainwaves, for example, while people are doing tasks, and see if we can predict when they're making good responses versus bad ones, things like that. So we worked at that diligently for about 10 years, but kind of ran out of cash. I had 2 kids, had to put food on the table, so I did about another 15 years worth of neuroscience at UNC Chapel Hill, developing EEG methods and validating them in a different context. So that was all going on in the background. Anyway, moved to Charlottesville in 2002 in order to live with my wife, who was one of Ian's colleagues, and also intensify work on a project that had begun in 1998. This was under the auspices of Esalen Institute out in California. The co-founder of Esalen, Mike Murphy, is a really extraordinary character in many ways, one of which is that he knew a good bit about the history of psychical research. He's very interested in this question of survival, and he knew that there were some people actually working on it from a scientific point of view. So he convened a group, including a bunch of us from DOPS, tried to get Ian, but Ian wouldn't go, got us together to present and discuss survival research. Thank you. So we did that for a couple of years. We went through a lot of the existing evidence and so on, but then we began to realize that we really had a much bigger task that we wanted to carry out. We were all convinced that physicalism is false. And we wanted to try and demonstrate that, and also begin to try and figure out, if it's wrong, what different kind of worldview might be better. So we spent actually almost 9 years on the first part of that problem, and that resulted in this book, Tracy's copy, Irreducible Mind. And what we tried to do in there was to assemble in one place a lot of the kinds of evidence that we think show empirically that physicalism is false. First and foremost, of course, psi and survival, all that research. We didn't really discuss it in this book, but we provided extensive annotated bibliography, pointers into the literature. You know, a lot of scientists would like to think that these things are kind of some isolated anomaly. You can just kind of quarantine them somewhere and ignore them, basically. But that's not at all the case, because there are plenty of other empirical phenomena that point in the same kind of direction. And so we systematically inventoried a number of those phenomena in this book. I'll give you just a couple of the examples of the kind of things that we looked at. And by the way, in doing this, we were really reevaluating a wonderful book that had been published in 1903 by one of William James's colleagues, F.W.H. Myers. It was called Human Personality and Its Survival of Bodily Death. If only he had left off that "and its survival of bodily death," it would be much better known today than it is. But we revisited a lot of the topics that Myers had brought out in his book in light of the intervening century of additional research. And the net of this whole effort was to show that Myers's thesis was actually much stronger now in light of all that additional evidence than it had seemed even back then. So we covered things, for example, like extreme psychophysiological influence. Turns out that a few people in hypnotic states can generate, for example, geometrically shaped blisters corresponding to a, say, cool poker that's been touched to their skin. There are things like stigmata. You know, fervently believing Catholics sometimes are capable of reproducing the wounds of Christ as they imagine them to have been on their own bodies. And these are things in terms of their sort of precision go beyond the known capacities of the nervous system to account for. Well, we have chapters on things like multiple personality, sometimes a personality of much greater capacity than the everyday personality suddenly appears, takes over, may know about personality A while personality A doesn't know anything about personality B. Again, very hard to account for in neurophysiological terms. We've got a big chapter on memory. I personally think one of the most important areas that we touched upon is what Bruce was talking about, near-death experiences, and in particular those that occur under extreme physiological conditions such as cardiac arrest and deep general anesthesia. And that's because there is a very strong consensus in contemporary neuroscience about what the conditions are that are required for conscious experience. And here we have cases in which those conditions have been abolished or very seriously degraded, and yet people are not only having experiences, but the most intense and important experiences they ever had in their whole lives. Psi even figures into some of this work because a key feature is the ability to show that the experience was occurring at the time the person was out, because the person can report something that happened during that time that he would have no means of knowing about. We also talk about stuff like extreme forms of genius and mystical experiences. Mystical experiences, you know, they're hardly talked about at all in the contemporary science literature, and to the extent they are, it's mostly to be pathologized or, you know, ignored. Now, all these things together lead to a picture of how mind and brain work together. We're not denying that the brain has a lot to do with ordinary experience, but we're rethinking the way it works. And this is, again, along lines that William James announced over a century ago. You know, the conventional view looks at the correlation. Everybody agrees there's a strong correlation between properties of mental experience and what goes on in the brain. The question is, how do you interpret these correlations? The conventional view is to say, well, they show that the brain produces consciousness. You get hit on the head, your consciousness gets weaker, you know, drink too much, whatever. Now, you might say, well, but wait, I take a thought to raise my arm and the damn thing goes up in the air. Isn't that mental influence on the physical? Well, the tricky answer from the physicalist side is that thought you had was just a pattern of activity in your brain, physical on physical, no problem. But we found a number of places where that argument can be overcome. And so the picture that arises is one in which the mind is inherently something much bigger than we customarily know about. Our everyday consciousness arises from the interaction of that larger something with the brain as it's going through its ordinary activities. So the brain is a kind of device for anchoring this larger consciousness to the here and now for biological purposes and that sort of thing. Brain conditions mind, but does not generate it. Now, for me, that was a huge thing in relation to the whole survival issue. If conventional physicalism is true, there can't be survival, period. It's absolutely inescapable. And even scientists who have some kind of religious practice can only manage that by sort of ignoring the conflict. William James had it best. He said, good materialist scientists by day, good Christian husbands and fathers by night, holding thus loosely the two ends of a chain, they are careless of the intermediate connection. So, if you're not careless, you have to just recognize that fact. But with this different picture of how the mind-brain thing works, there's an opening for survival. For me, that was personally decisive. I had never been able to take the possibility of survival seriously until we finished this book, basically, and I became convinced that Myers and James really had it right way back when. All right, now I got just a few minutes left, I guess. How are we doing? I'm not paying any attention. 5 minutes, okay. Okay, that was the easy part, irreducible mind. Then we went on to consider the question. This is, we're about year 10 at this point. We met once a year out at Esalen for these 5-day things, and then lots of interactions for the rest of the year of various kinds. Okay, but the second part of this problem is much, much harder, and that is accepting that all these different kinds of phenomena are for real. How can we conceive of reality in such a way that it becomes plausible that these things happen? How must reality be constituted in order that these various kinds of phenomena cataloged in irreducible mind can occur? Well, the basic strategy that we pursued in trying to grope toward an answer, and let me just start by saying we do not have an absolutely definitive answer by any means. We feel like we're kind of going in the right direction. What we did was to revisit a number of systems, big systems of thought, both ancient and modern, that have taken the reality of at least some of these phenomena for granted and gone through that exercise of trying to figure out, well, how are things so that you can, have psi phenomena and survival and so on. So we looked at things like Patanjali and yoga, the Neoplatonists, later developments in Hindu philosophy, Kashmiri Shaivism, extending down even to a guy like Aurobindo, and I see you nodding back there. You know about this stuff. We also inventoried several modern physical systems. We had a couple of quantum theorists and a cosmologist who have their own ideas about, developments of physics that would accommodate stuff. We visited a number of modern Western philosophers, including Alfred North Whitehead. Well, we went back as far as Leibniz. We've got a chapter on Leibniz in our book. What I'm driving to is our second book, Beyond Physicalism, subtitled Toward Reconciliation of Science and Spirituality. And that really is the punchline of the whole exercise. Because, chapters 14 and 15 in this book are the kind of summary of where we have gotten to so far in this process. And the bottom line is that if you take the existence of these various rogue phenomena seriously and attempt to figure out how things must be in order for them to happen, we believe you are driven inexorably into metaphysical territory shared with the world's great traditional faiths. That doesn't mean it endorses any particular one of them in all details, but that they have certain things in common. And in particular, the idea that seems to be emerging most forcefully is that, contrary to the recent spate of attacks on all things religious from representatives of classical physicalism, there is at the heart of reality some kind of enormous conscious something that we are somehow connected with in the deepest parts of our being, that is expressing itself through the evolution of the whole world as we experience it. It has a name. I won't even quote it, but I recommend that you look at that if you're interested. The bottom line really is that I personally believe that we are at or very close to a major inflection point in Western intellectual history. It's going to happen, whether it happens next year or next century, who knows? It's hard to tell about these things. The great social forces flying around out there, potential for good and evil that we see on the news each day. But it will happen. And the kind of work that we do at DOPS, I think, has a lot to do with making it happen. And I think, we have 50 years of accomplishment behind ourselves. We've got our conceptual and technical and practical situation pretty well in hand. And we hope you'll all be with us as we try to carry the whole subject further in whatever ways you can. Thank you.